he says, "For the wrath of God is revealed of heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it to them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." So you got Moses' testimony, you got Jesus' testimony, you got Paul's testimony that the world's been created. So the dilemma you face by going back to one of these theories is you essentially, all these testimony, these witnesses, they're either truth tellers or they were lying. And it's an indictment on the... And so the reason why this is such a powerful dilemma is because you wonder why the world's left God, and you wonder why the world's left... why God has been removed from society. But this can be traced back to something even before that. Back in Genesis, the word Genesis, it says, the definition of day, look at that sentence there. It says, "In my father's day, he could drive across the country in 6 days during the day." And we all understand from the context that there's 3 definitions of day there. And the first part of this is in my father's day. That means during the age of my father. We understand it's during the age of. And then the second part, he could drive it in 6 days, which means 6 literal days, 24-hour periods. And the last part where it says during the day means while it's daylight. So we see in our English, when we look at Scripture, we should approach it the same way. So let's look at the Old Testament. The Old Testament has 2,000 usages of the word day. And 2,000 times the word day in Hebrew is a literal day. Rarely in Genesis used as a general period of time. Sometimes it's used for the day of the Lord. Then if it's used with a number, meaning like the first day, this happened on the second day, God created this on the third day. If it's associated with a number, then it's always a literal day. If it's used with the word evening or morning, it's always a literal day. And in Genesis chapter 1, not a single Hebrew word that means a long period of time was used. So day in Genesis 1 meant a literal day. And that's just from understanding the context and understanding the usage, just like we understood the English sentence above on the use of the word day. We see from the Old Testament, when God used the word day there, he associated with evening and morning. He associated with light and darkness, and he associated with a number, meaning first, second, third, all the way up through the 6th day. So historically speaking, the church fathers and scholars all believed in the creation and the flood. That's been all throughout history. Even the secular scientific giants, Galileo, Newton, all the people who came through the Enlightenment, through the Dark Ages, they all believed as well in that humanity and the created world were all basically the same age. They coexisted. There was no, development period and then man came on the scene. That man and humanity has always been there at the same time. But it all changed when uniformitarianism entered the picture in the 1800s. It was called the Age of Enlightenment. And what happened is, before, man would use reason and revelation to make discoveries in philosophical thought and science. It was basically what you saw of what God did in your application of it. But what they did is they wanted to throw God out of the picture, and they changed that during the Age of Enlightenment to be man's reason only. So they took the revelation part off. Basically, it eliminated God and the Bible as and I think my batteries are going dead. And it says, it threw off the rules of morality, which is demanded by Christianity, and it recognized, and the other, when I say it recognized the hypocrisy of the compromised church, a lot of people talk about the Inquisition and abuses of the Catholic Church during that period, where the Catholic Church got involved in politics. The fall of the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church arose, and then it became a political entity, and it controlled the world. And during that time, so when these people in the Enlightenment, they wanted to say, hey, the church is corrupt. Martin Luther recognized that the Catholic Church was corrupt because he said that, hey, I need to nail these 99 theses on the wall of the Church of Wittenberg, saying, hey, you shouldn't be doing this, you shouldn't be doing that. And so they realized, these men of the Age of Enlightenment realized that, hey, the church is compromised, and because it's compromised, we need to get rid of it. So that's why they got rid of reason plus revelation and made it reason only. And so there was a great debate happening right at that time when this was all happening in the early 1800s and late 1700s, is there was a great debate about geology and whether or not igneous rock, which is rock that's being created by volcanic action, or is it sedimentary rock that's been deposited by water flow. So what they went out is, this happened in the UK, they looked at geology not as science, but actually understanding how could this be? We've got sedimentary rock here, and we see the layers of it, and then we also have lava flows, which we know from Vesuvius and other volcanoes that erupted. They also see plains of lava flows. So there's a debate on how those things formed. Was it done by vulcanization, which means by volcanic activity, or by faults, earthquakes and things? So the rules of the road, they said you had to have two assumptions. And those assumptions were naturalism, which is basically, if your senses can't perceive it, then it doesn't exist. Only your senses perceive is all that exists, which means nature only, and the supernatural is taken out of the picture. And they took supernatural out because what is the Bible full of? It's the miraculous. God, through his miraculous providence and power, went from the creation all the way up to bringing his son and through a miracle, and then he raised him from the dead through a miracle, and then all the miracles of the apostles, plus all the other evidence we have of the Old Testament. So all that supernatural stuff, these men threw out because naturalism says if you don't perceive it with your senses, then it can't exist. And then uniformitarianism came out because it was basically whatever they could measure with their eyes and see through science, something that's observed, then if it can't be observed, then it wasn't then they couldn't use that for science anymore. But the interesting point about this, when it comes to geology, they don't know how it started, and since you can't see the start of the thing, it's not science anyway. So this is what happened. Two Charleses gotten involved. There's a guy named Charles Lyell, who in the early 1800s, from 1830 to 1833, wrote 3 volumes of things called Principles of Geology. He was a deist. He believed in God, but he believed in the God that created it and then let it wind down. So basically, God's not involved in your life. There's no resurrection. God just basically started the thing, and then he's just watching. That was his position. And he basically said what he wanted to do, because he believed that, is he was a very good persuader. He was a good orator, and he wanted to introduce this idea of geology into culture without upsetting the church. And so he did this very interesting way. He did that by destroying the credibility. He wanted to destroy the credibility of the scriptures, and he also wanted to dismiss Noah's flood. So he created something called a false dichotomy. And what that means is he wanted to create a war between science and religion. He talked about light versus dark. And then he also wanted to create something called the politics of exclusion, which basically means if the person you're talking to doesn't agree with you, you ridicule them, you mock them, you remove them from society. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So that was the first Charles. So Charles basically said he wanted to get the Bible and Noah's flood out of science completely, and he did it by mocking his skeptics. And he did it so well that the church accepted him and didn't throw up any roadblocks. Then Charles Darwin, who read Charles Lyell's books while he was on his trip around the world on the HMS Beagle, and out of that, in 1859, Charles Darwin, who we get the theory of evolution from, wrote The Origin of Species, which demands natural selection, deep time, uniformitarianism, and the rejection of Noah's flood. What is interesting about Charles Darwin, I didn't say everybody, he used a rhetorical trick. He called it the logic of possibility. The more possibilities, he said, hey, is this possible? Is this possible? Is this possible? Then there's a greater probability that it will happen. Which, that sounds good on the surface because deep time and natural selection require a lot of time for this mechanism to work. But the idea of having more possibilities, mathematically speaking, the odds of it happening get bigger. So just like that, in that one lesson we talked about information, where we saw that the word, just say send me money, and it had 17 characters, the chances of a person pulling out 17 correct letters for that 17 message was like 1 in 10 billion. And so statistically speaking, the more possibilities you have means that the probability is actually greater, is less, that the number is small, it's impossible. So despite this being proven to be false form of thinking, he was so persuasive in talking to people, he got them to believe it. So they ended up believing a lie, even though it couldn't be proven, and it was elevated to truth. So the Enlightenment dominated the scientific culture, and the consequence was, as new scientific data information emerged later in the 1800s and in the 20th century, all of that new information had to fit these two Charleses' worldview. So if it didn't fit, you weren't allowed to think outside the box as a scientist. So if you didn't accept Darwin and Lyell and their ideas, you weren't allowed to participate in society. You weren't allowed to do research. You weren't allowed to ask questions. So they put you into a box. So then this guy's interesting. His name is Paul Feyerabend, and he's a philosopher of science. And which says, a well-trained rationalist will obey the mental image of his master, conform to the standards of argumentation he has learned, and adhere to these standards no matter how great the confusion in which he finds himself, being quite incapable of realizing that what he regards as the voice of reason is but a causal effect of the training he has received. Basically what that says is, if you give me your child and allow me to instruct it and teach it, the more I repeat myself and the more that culture supports that child is going to believe that no matter what is told to it later in life. That's basically what's it. And to give you a modern day example of this, somewhere earlier in the last 20, 30 years, some person decided that there was genders and that gender was separate from your sex. So now we have a multiplicity of genders. All the kids are being taught in school to accept all the genders, and that persons can transition between genders. You've got major universities performing surgeries on people who think they're in the wrong gender, cutting off body parts of people. So you have doctors, you have academia, you have money, and you have all of society. Now we're kind of waking up to it, but how did we believe that lie? It's because of this right here. You train somebody and you teach somebody from childhood that this is okay and this is true. No matter if it's true or not, when they get older, they're going to believe it, and it's going to be very, very difficult for that person to get out of that. And they're going to think it's they're being smart, that it's the voice of reason, but it's really just the effect of being indoctrinated. Indoctrination is actually a good word, if it's good indoctrination. But if it's bad, it can be awful. And you see a whole society, we remove God from society, and what's replaced it is mental illness. And this mental illness has got doctors who are claiming it's affirming care to chemically castrate young men and to remove body parts from young women who think they're in the wrong body. So this is a very real thing. So the sudden aging of the earth, three main aspects of rocks were based upon the origin of valleys, past volcanism, and the thickness of sedimentary rock. So what they've done is, back at that time in the 1800s, when they were looking to say, hey, how do we explain these sedimentary rocks and what we see? Well, they assumed that the rate of erosion that they saw was constant, which demanded uniformitarianism. And anything that was catastrophic as the Noah's flood was out. So if they couldn't see it, it didn't exist. So what they did see is this thing called the geological column. So they saw sedimentary rock. This happened in the United Kingdom. They see all these layers, which when we go out and see the Grand Canyon, you see all these layers. And then what they found is in those layers, they saw fossil remains. And each layer had a different type of fossil in it. So they deducted, say, hey, that means in that layer, only that organism lived. And then when over millions of years, the next layer was put on top of those fossils, and the next layer, those organisms now are higher on the food chain, and then those were deposited. And these sedimentary rocks are thousands of feet deep. So they said, okay, all this, because we see sedimentary rock now being laid down gradually by rivers, it's got to be millions and millions of years. So they came up with this idea, and that was called, it was called fossil succession. So they're force-fed. The later rocks, later on, as this idea developed, whenever they found new evidence or new things, they always had to put it in this fossil succession. So it became circular reasoning. So anytime new science came on board, they would put it into these geological columns. So those millions and billions of years that you saw at the very beginning, the first slide, the secular facts, those were based on those men saying, okay, it must be this way. The bottom must be billions of years old, and then the next one's so many billion, and they just go up the food chain, and that's how everything was done. And it's interesting. So in America, by 1870, the secular revolution had replaced the Christian worldview. And major publishers, so they not only did they push it scientifically, then they went to the textbooks. And they had major publishers publishing all these books saying evolution and positivism is true, which is positivism just basically means if you can't sense it with your senses, then it's not real. So history is written by the victors. Since these guys won the battle, so to speak, when it came to science and ideas, they took control of knowledge. And from that point on, whatever questions, they determined what questions would be asked. They determined what is researched. They determined what is published. And if there's any disagreement over deep time or evolution, that research wasn't allowed, and that disagreement wasn't allowed. Basically, what we call that now is called a captured industry. So when things are captured, and we talk about big ag, we talk about big pharma, we talk about big military industrial complex, and you wonder how all these systems are able to get corrupted is because it's a circle. One makes money based off the other person's information, and if you can tell that person, hey, I want you to research this so that way this product can be produced, and when that product's produced, I'll give you a share of it, and so it becomes a circle, and it ends up being corrupted. But what's interesting is even though we're recognizing now that most industries have been corrupted by being captured by this circle of money, the same thing was happening there with knowledge back then. So man hasn't changed any. He's always been the same. So naturalism basically led to the rejection of Noah's flood and the acceptance of deep time. Deep time explains how at the current rate, Earth's geological features were formed: river valleys, volcanic terrain, and sedimentary rocks. However, it couldn't explain the Ice Age and many other things about rocks and fossils. Here are the anomalies that we've covered, some of them. This one's interesting. The Grand Canyon, the bottom 60% of the Grand Canyon, that layer, which is about 600 meters thick, which is almost 2,000 feet. So think about it, 2,000 feet of sedimentary rock that's been laid down, can be traced over 600 miles, 1,000 kilometers, and it's all the same, which means it couldn't have been deposited by one river. It's a single uninterrupted deposit, and the geologists can't explain how that happened if it was done gradually over time. The present rate of erosion that they measure now with all the rivers and going through America, it would take about 10 million years for us to get to sea level. Well, if the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, their math is off by 4.59 billion. So even Even though if they do use, even though 10 million years has been, even though 10 million years has transpired according to their model, and all of the Earth would be flat due to erosion, it doesn't matter to them. It doesn't, and to me that's interesting. So even though they have conflicts, 95% of the fossils are marine invertebrates. What that means is they're animal life, they have shells. So if 95% of those fossils have shells, what we know now, when a clam or a mussel or whatever dies, that shell is locked closed, but what happens when they die is that soft tissue that's holding that clam dies as well, and then it opens. That's the natural process of clams and mussels. That's why once you break them open and they die, but when most of the shells that are found in the fossil record are closed, which demands that they were buried very fast, either buried alive or buried as soon as after they died. And this is all in that fossil record. So you got 95% of those fossils, all marine invertebrates, most of them, and they all have closed shells. So they didn't die and lay down gradually over time and be deposited. There was a flood in Iceland in 1996 that basically created 200 layers of sediment 50 feet deep, and it did it in 17 hours. There was a Lake Missoula flood from the Ice Age that caused 50 cubic miles to be eroded, 130 feet thick, and it did it in days. Extrapolating from that, if you multiply that Lake Missoula flood by 1,000, according to how much of the earth is covered in sedimentary rock, or you multiply the effects of that Icelandic flood by 50,000 to replicate the earth, it would take basically a year for that rock to be laid down. Guess how long the flood was? Basically a year. So even these events with these evidences of floods moving sedimentary layers show that in a year the global flood could do all that. Coal is a outlier as well. Coal is formed by the mechanism they call, how coal is formed is called the peat swamp mechanism. It's a very delicate process. It takes millions of years to happen. Plant material sinks in a slightly acidic environment, then thousands of meters of sediment have to cover it. And once it gets to 10 times the pressure of the rock that's on top, that's been deposited over this plant material, then enough heat is generated to create coal. So this process is how they say coal is formed. The problems with this process is this. Coal deposits, if you go look at them, are thick and pure and there's no contamination. So if it takes millions of years to make this peat swamp mechanism happen with these sediments, they're saying not once did anything get in there that wouldn't, the sediment that layer over the top of it was not contaminated. When we look at our coal deposits, they're not contaminated, so there's no way that over millions of years it wouldn't be contaminated because of all the ebb and flow of waters. Peat swamp must be near sea level, and the reason for that is because of the fossils being there. The top and bottom of the coal seams are exactly flat, and that has to be explained. And then the coal formation is not a present process. They can't find coal forming anywhere. Therefore, it contradicts the doctrine of uniformitarianism. Noah's flood provides the mechanism by which to create coal. It was the current amount of carbon that is in coal today is 8 times the amount of all the vegetation of the earth. So the coal that we have deposited in our land all over the world, what's currently in there has 8 times of all the plants what we see today. To me, that's amazing. That means the pre-flood condition must have been just vegetation. So pre-flood vegetation that's being destroyed and ripped up by the global flood would provide the vegetation necessary to create the coal that we have. And its rapid burial and the thick sediment of the rock put on top of it would create the environment of those layers of those thousands of feet, which would provide the pressure and also the marine environment. Because the flood was a marine environment, it creates that's why the fossils are there. So all the right conditions for the formation of coal happen because of the flood, not because of a gradual process, as they call the sweet, can't can't even say the word now, the peat swamp mechanism. The global flood is how that happened. The other problem with the anomaly of setting the clocks right is the Ice Age. What's surprising is the uniformitarian scientists didn't know there was an Ice Age. And all of a sudden, new evidence came up and said, oh, we've had a global Ice Age, and they saw evidence of it. And then, because of the overwhelming evidence, now they need to say, well, if we can't explain Ice Ages. This Ice Age that we had, now we have to say there's multiple Ice Ages. Just like we talked before about this universe, that there's only one. They created multiverses statistically, so that way they could, and they did the same thing with this problem. The conditions of an Ice Age, you have to have much cooler summers. The winters are already cold enough to have an Ice Age right now. You have to have abundant moisture, and you have to have climate change must persist for many years for the Ice Ages to happen. The Ice Age was a phenomenon that was produced by an absolute right. They came up with all these theories, and some of them were remotely possible. Most of them were contradicted each other, and most of them felt palpably inadequate, according to this Ice Age expert from the 57. And then in 1997, the U.S. News and World Report said it had 18 mysteries of science, and one of those 18 mysteries they listed was what causes Ice Ages. So even today, they really don't know what causes Ice Ages, but if you look at the global flood, it allows for it. There's a tremendous amount of volcanism, which basically means when volcanoes erupted, they cause volcanic ash. If anybody's seen when Mount St. Helens goes up, when a volcano goes up anywhere in the world, there's all these flight restrictions. You can't fly there because all this volcanic ash gets up in the atmosphere, and it can destroy the engines of the airplane, and the airplane, obviously, if you don't want your engines to go out. So when I've experienced that where I've not been allowed to fly certain places because of volcanic ash. Now think about the earth being broken up and the flood coming and all these volcanoes happening, that ash would get in the atmosphere and that would cause the cold summers, which is one of the requirements. Then the underwater volcanism underneath the deeps would create warmer oceans. And because the oceans were warmer, then that would increase evaporation. And they measured that a 30-degree change in the temperature of the ocean would create 7 times the amount of evaporation and snow coverage in the upper latitudes. So basically, they modeled this mechanism and said it would take 500 years to create the glacial ice age that they see evidence of, and it would take 200 years for it to get to recede to where it is now. So basically, in 700 years, this model that they developed from looking at this, that Noah's flood, after the flood was over, they had an ice age for 700 years, and then we are where we're at now. So how do dating methods work? Basically, you want a rate of change. So here's an easy calculation. If I give you a 100-gallon fish tank and a faucet that adds 10 gallons per hour, and the tank is right now half full at 50 gallons, how long did it take to fill? And so you basically just take 50 gallons, you divide it by the rate of 10 gallons per hour, and you come up with 5 hours. Well, that's how all dating methods work. But they make assumptions. First of all, the assumption is you have to assume that faucet, nobody changes the faucet, that it's a constant rate. You also have to assume that the fish tank didn't have any water in it to begin with. And the other thing is you have to assume it's a closed system, that the fish tank's not leaking and that nobody else has added water or subtracted water while. So the only way you can know for sure that dating method is accurate is if you observe the entire process. Then you can say it's scientific. Otherwise, the assumptions are necessary. So what they found in the soft dinosaur tissue where these animals died. When you have death, tissue decays relatively quickly. Fossilization only occurs when it's buried quickly and the decay hasn't destroyed it yet. Soft tissue shouldn't exist in the fossil record, but they found some. So soft tissue discoveries have been seen in unfossilized dinosaur bones. They retested these samples 17 times over to make sure they were real. They concluded that these soft tissues cannot be older than a few thousand years. So now they're scrambling for answers because that doesn't fit their paradigm. Remember, anything that's outside the box, they have to ignore. So dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago. Fact check false. Various dating methods are greatly exaggerated. True. Information suggests that it's not older than several thousand years. So the clear-cut decision that is deep time doesn't exist. But they will never accept it. Here's another anomaly. The oceans are not salty enough. The ocean salinity, we can measure it, how much sodium is getting in, how much sodium is present, and how much sodium is leaving, which is all measurable. So in 62 million years is how old the ocean is according to the measurements. But they're saying the Earth is actually 4.6 billion years old, so they're again off just by how salty the ocean is by 4.54 billion years. This is the maximum, so basically 74 times the maximum rate of change. So uniformitarianism, even when they use simple models like this, they can't escape it. We'll come back with this next week. We'll talk about the Earth's magnetic field, which I thought this was very interesting because I used the magnetic field to fly around the world. So we'll talk about that next. Thank you for your attention.